everyone, welcome to this revision video based on Piaget's theory of cognitive development. As we go through this video, feel free to pause so that you've got some time to write notes down, make them into something that makes sense to you and that you're going to remember. Remember that the more active your revision is, the better you will remember everything rather than just listening to me and hoping it stays in your head. Okay, so Piaget's theory of cognitive development. The first thing we need to understand before we get into his theory is what is a schema. So schemas are part of your cognition, and cognition is all of your thought processes. So when we talk about cognitive development, we're talking about the development of your thought processes, which is essentially learning. Okay, so schemas are kind of like filing cabinets. They organise and contain information. So your mind is like a big filing cabinet, and each file in the cabinet is a schema. So you might have a schema for restaurants, and that schema tells you what to expect in a restaurant and helps you to understand what you need to do when you get there. You might have a schema for dogs, so that you can recognise the dogs and you know what they are and how they're likely to act. You also have a me schema. So this is a schema all about yourself and includes all the information that you know or think about yourself. You have millions of these schemas in your mind. Okay? So if schemas are the way that we organise and store thoughts and information in our minds, we need to link that when we get new information. Okay? And this is where Piaget's theory of cognitive development comes in. Because when you learn, you need to somehow change your schemas, and you can do this in two different ways. Assimilation is when you update the same schema that you already had. So let's go back to that example of a dog schema. So you've got a dog schema as a child, and you think that relatively fluffy things that bound around with 4 legs and a tail are dogs. Now, the dog that you own is a big Labrador. But then when you're out on a walk, you see a tiny little poodle and you say to your mum, "What's that?" When she tells you that it is a dog, you need to update the information that you had about your dog schema and include this very different looking dog in that schema. So then next time you're out and about, you're on your walk with Dad next time and you see a cat and you think, it's got 4 legs, it's got a tail and it's running around. That must be a dog. When Dad then corrects you and says it's a cat, you need to create a new schema for that cat. Okay, so that's when you put another file into the filing cabinet and create a new schema. Now, this constant updating and creation of schemas is what cognitive psychologists would call learning, because you're updating the information that you have got about the world around you. So, this is Piaget. He developed the rest of his theory of cognitive development through observations of children when they were taking IQ tests and when they were playing with his own children. And he noticed that some of the mistakes that they were making seemed to be universal across children, but dependent on their age. So the kind of mistake that they were making changed depending on whether they were really young, whether a little bit older, or whether they were kind of secondary school age. So he developed 4 stages of development. Now, it's important to note that these stages are invariant and universal. So invariant means that they are specified in their order. Okay, so everyone is going to move through them in this particular order, and they are universal, which means they apply to everyone. They're kind of innate. You're born with the right kind of processes that mean that you're going to move through all 4 stages. Piaget also said that children were little scientists, and in order to move through these stages, they interacted with the world, tested things out, and then moved on by updating or creating new schemas. So it's important to understand what skills children have, and particularly which reasoning skills children have at each stage. So we start with the sensory motor stage, which is when they are 0 to 2. Now at this point, babies learn about the world through their senses, touching, tasting, seeing and hearing, and by moving around their environment. So they start to be little scientists straight away, and this explains why really young children will kind of put anything that they find in their mouth and they'll hold it in their hands because they're trying to figure out the world through their senses. Now, it's at this stage that they develop what's called object permanence, and that's the understanding that things exist even when they can't see them anymore. So if you hide something under a blanket, very, very young children won't think to keep looking for it because they'll just assume it's disappeared from the world. It's only as they get slightly older, as they move through this sensory motor stage, that they start looking for it because they know it's still there. This is also the point where peekaboo gets a little bit less exciting, because when they were really, really young, they actually thought you were disappearing, whereas once they develop object permanence, they understand that you're just hiding behind your hands. Now, the next stage is when children start going to school, and so they start to develop their reasoning skills. However, there are still errors in reasoning, okay? So they're starting to understand how to reason about their world, but there are still things that they get wrong. So the first thing that they get wrong is something called animism, and they believe that inanimate objects have feelings. Okay, and the second thing is that they are egocentric in their thought processes. So they think that everyone sees the world the way they do. Now, I mean that both physically, in terms of what you can see, depending on which side of the classroom you stand on, and also emotionally, in terms of understanding someone else's point of view. Children in the pre-operational stage often can't understand someone else's point of view, either physically or more emotionally or morally. However, when they get to between 7 and 11, they develop these reasoning skills in a concrete way. So this concrete means that they can do so when they are thinking about objects that are in front of them, that they can see and that they can feel. Two key things that they develop here: conservation, which is the understanding that if the appearance of something changes, other characteristics such as the mass or the volume or the number don't change. And this in particular links to Piaget's study, that is our key study in the course. And then the second skill is decentration. So we talked about pre-operational children being egocentric. Once you get to 7 to 11 years old, you then develop the ability to see the world from a different point of view. Again, both physically and emotionally. But once more, it is important to note that this is true of reasoning skills that stay in the concrete and physical world. So when children can see and feel those objects, okay? Because then when they get to 11 plus, so when we start thinking about starting secondary school, children start to understand abstract thinking. So they can reason about these objects now without having to see them. And this is why, if you think about when you were younger, in maths in primary school, you had lots of manipulables. So you used things like the blocks that help you count from tens, your units and your tens. Then once you're in once you're 11 years old, you're expected to be able to do that by just thinking about the numbers in an abstract way, which is why you can start to understand things like negative numbers too, even though you couldn't physically represent them. They can also start to understand hypothetical situations, and so can understand the idea of imagining something without it being true. Okay? So that leaves us with most of the theory of how children learn and how they develop through those stages. As always, we need some criticisms too. So the first one is that Piaget has been criticised for underestimating the age at which children can achieve different parts of the stages. For example, if we think about that idea of looking for something under a blanket, when Piaget said that to begin with, children don't understand that there's something there because they don't look for it under the blanket. Well, it might actually be that they just don't have the coordination to continue looking for it when they're younger. And because they can't speak yet and we can't communicate with them, we can't tell whether they know that that object is still there or not. The second criticism is that Piaget just describes the different stages, but doesn't actually explain how children move from one to the other. Yes, he talks about them being a little scientist, but doesn't say so much about how we learn these particular reasoning skills and how they become part of our cognitive processes. Finally, we can say that Piaget's theory can be considered reductionist, which means it focuses just on one part, and this is because he didn't take into account the important role that teachers have in children's learning. I like to think I'm pretty important. I like to think that learning wouldn't happen so well without me, and I like to think that lockdown proved that for us just before the summer. But Piaget's theory doesn't take this into account. Instead, it suggests that children would be able to continue through this cognitive development just on their own without having anyone to help them. And that has been criticised for being reductionist. So that is the basic understanding of Piaget's theory and stages of cognitive development, and also some of the criticisms. Anything that you didn't understand, go back, have another look, have a think about it. Have a look online or in any of the textbooks, or come and speak to one of your teachers so that we can explain it to you before the assessment. Well done for getting through that, and I will see you at school.